Suffering is not an accident in human life, it is a structure. It is not simply something that happens to us. It is woven into the fabric of our psychic existence. We imagine that if circumstances were different, if luck favored us, if fate were kinder, then suffering would vanish. But suffering does not disappear, it mutates, it shifts, it takes new forms. For even when pain is removed externally, the psyche has ways of reproducing it internally. You see, the mind is not only a theater of pleasure, but also of repetition, conflict, and unresolved desire. From the beginning, the human being is split between instinct and repression. We desire boundless pleasure, yet we live in societies that demand control, limitation, order. Civilization itself is built upon renunciation of instincts, of impulses, of forbidden wishes. And what happens to what is repressed? It does not vanish. It lingers, it returns, it disguises itself in symptoms, in anxieties, in obsessions, in dreams. Suffering, therefore, is not merely an external fact of life, but the inevitable consequence of our psychic structure. To suffer is to exist between what we want and what we are allowed, and this is why suffering is so difficult to let go of. It is not simply pain inflicted from outside. It is often bound up with our unconscious attachments, our unresolved conflicts, even our secret pleasures. We cling to suffering because it gives form to our chaos. It gives continuity to our identity. It repeats a pattern familiar from our earliest experiences. We recreate the same wounds, not because we enjoy them consciously, but because the psyche seeks to resolve what it could never master in the past. Suffering becomes a cycle, an unfinished story we cannot stop telling ourselves. Suffering is not an aberration of life, nor a mistake to be corrected. It is the natural consequence of the very structure of human existence. From the first breath, man is caught in a paradox. He is driven by instinctual impulses that demand immediate gratification, yet he is born into a world governed by limitations, rules, and prohibitions. His psyche is built upon this tension. The infant cries for the mother's breast and discovers both satisfaction and frustration. Pleasure is possible, but never infinite. This first confrontation with the reality principle, learning that the world does not bend fully to desire, is the beginning of suffering. What Freud observed is that suffering cannot be eradicated, because it is produced by the conflict between our instinctual life and the constraints of civilization. On one side lies the pleasure principle, the desire for boundless satisfaction of hunger, lust, power, and comfort. On the other side lies the external world, indifferent and often hostile, which denies these wishes. Civilization itself functions by demanding renunciation of instinct. Laws, morality, religion, and social codes exist precisely to restrict the free flow of drives that, if unleashed, would destabilize the community. Thus, every individual is forced into compromise. To belong, he must repress. To live among others, he must surrender parts of himself. And this renunciation does not come without cost. What is forbidden does not vanish, it lives on, trapped in the unconscious, seeking disguised expression. The suffering of man, then, is not only imposed from outside, it is generated within by the very repression that makes him civilized. Even in moments of peace, when external conditions seem favorable, suffering persists because the psyche itself produces conflict. Dreams betray wishes that cannot be admitted by waking consciousness. Symptoms appear as compromises between repressed desires and the demands of morality. Anxiety emerges as a signal of forbidden impulses pressing toward awareness. In each case, suffering is the voice of the divided psyche, the inevitable result of being torn between instinct and restraint. The price of becoming human, of transforming from animal to member of civilization, is a life marked by inner dissatisfaction. This is why attempts to imagine a life free from suffering are illusory. Change the environment, soften the burdens of work, improve material conditions still, suffering will find its way back, because it is not only the cruelty of the world that makes us suffer, but the very construction of our psychic life. Even when life improves, the psyche repeats old conflicts, replays forgotten traumas, and resurrects unfulfilled desires. We suffer not only from what happens to us, but from what leaves within us, unresolved and unexpressed. Thus, suffering is not a foreign invader, but a structural companion to existence. It arises naturally from the gap between what we long for and what we are permitted to have, between our instinctual life and the demands of reality. It cannot be eliminated, only understood, interpreted, and perhaps transformed. To live as a human being is to live in this tension, and as long as there is this tension, suffering will remain, not as an accident, but as an essential feature of being alive. Repression is the great trickster of the human psyche, the silent force that ensures suffering never disappears but merely changes its costume. What is denied in consciousness does not dissolve into nothingness. It sinks, it hides, it burrows itself in the unconscious, waiting for a chance to return. This is the central paradox of repression. We believe we have rid ourselves of pain, fear, or desire by pushing it out of awareness, but in truth, we have merely transformed it into another shape, one more insidious, more disguised, and often more tormenting. Freud observed again and again that the act of repression does not destroy the content of our psychic life. Instead, it preserves it, immortalizes it, and condemns us to live with its distorted echoes. Think of the forbidden impulses of childhood, the primitive desires that society refuses to tolerate. The child learns quickly that certain wishes are unacceptable: aggression toward the parent, longing for complete possession of the mother, fantasies of omnipotence. These impulses are repressed because they threaten both the love of caregivers and the demands of the social order. But once repressed, they do not vanish. They remain within, forming the unconscious core of the personality. They reappear in dreams, which serve as the disguised theater of forbidden desires. They return in slips of the tongue, in sudden irrational emotions, in the compulsive repetition of mistakes. And most painfully, they resurface in the form of suffering, anxiety, phobias, obsessions, depression. What we believe to be a misfortune imposed from without is often a symptom created from within, born from the return of the repressed. Repression ensures that suffering is cyclical. It prevents us from fully mastering the past. Traumas we have not consciously faced do not disappear with time. They linger in silence, influencing behavior without our knowledge. A man who represses his anger may find himself suffering chronic anxiety, unable to explain why his body trembles. A woman who represses her grief may fall ill with fatigue and depression, without realizing she is haunted by what she has refused to mourn. Each symptom is both a disguise and a message, the return of something that once demanded expression but was denied. This is why repression guarantees that suffering will endure. The psyche is structured in such a way that what is not acknowledged insists on returning. It is as if the unconscious holds a ledger, recording every silenced desire, every forbidden impulse, every unprocessed pain. And this ledger demands payment, often in the form of neurotic suffering. We cannot outwit repression by simply ignoring it. The more we deny, the stronger the return. This is why people find themselves trapped in patterns they cannot explain, repeating the same conflicts in different forms as if compelled by an unseen hand. The truth is unsettling. Repression is necessary for civilization, but it is also the source of individual torment. Without repression, we would be ruled entirely by instinct, incapable of living with others. But with repression, we carry within us a reservoir of unfulfilled impulses that torment us from below the surface. Thus, suffering is the inevitable price of the very mechanism that makes social life possible. The compulsion to repeat is one of the most haunting discoveries of Freud, for it reveals that suffering is not merely an accident of life, but a pattern woven into the psyche itself. When an individual endures trauma, One might expect that he would avoid similar situations in the future, protecting himself from the return of pain. Yet, again and again, people find themselves reenacting the very wounds that once scarred them. The abused child grows into an adult who unconsciously seeks abusive partners. The humiliated worker moves from job to job, only to encounter the same degradation under new employers. The betrayed lover finds themselves repeatedly drawn to those who cannot be trusted. This is the repetition compulsion, the mysterious urge to relive suffering rather than escape it. Why does the psyche do this? Freud suggested that the unconscious carries within it an unfinished business, a kind of unresolved tension that demands discharge. The trauma, if not integrated consciously, remains frozen in time, trapped outside the flow of narrative memory. And because it has not been symbolized, not spoken, not mourned, it insists on being relived. The individual is compelled to stage it again, not because he enjoys it, but because the psyche strives for mastery over what was once overwhelming. By recreating the scene of suffering, the unconscious hopes to transform passive helplessness into active control. Yet this attempt rarely succeeds. Instead of mastery, the subject finds only repetition, suffering anew what was once unbearable. This is why suffering clings to us so fiercely. It is not simply a scar, but an active force within the unconscious, replaying itself until we confront it. The repetition compulsion binds us to the past, making us actors in a drama we did not consciously choose. It transforms life into a theater where old wounds are dressed in new costumes, but the script remains unchanged. We imagine we are choosing freely, but in truth, the unconscious guides us back toward the familiar pain, as if determined that we finally face it. Freud's insight here is devastating. What we do not integrate, we are doomed to repeat. The man who represses his anger may repeatedly find himself in situations where he is humiliated, as though life conspires to force his rage into expression. The woman who buries her grief may continually lose what she loves, each loss echoing the original unprocessed sorrow. In these cycles, suffering is not random, but meaningful. It is the language of the unconscious, demanding recognition. The repetition compulsion also reveals the paradoxical nature of suffering. We flee from pain consciously, yet we gravitate toward it unconsciously. The very thing we most dread becomes the magnet that shapes our choices. This paradox explains why so many remain trapped in destructive relationships, oppressive jobs, or self-sabotaging habits. It is not stupidity nor weakness, but the deep pull of the unconscious striving to resolve what has been left unresolved. Until the trauma is brought into awareness, until it is given words and integrated into the fabric of life, repetition will continue its merciless cycle. The unconscious is not a passive reservoir of forgotten memories, as many would wish to believe, but an active theater in which the dramas of our desires, fears, and traumas continue to play without our awareness. Freud saw it as the hidden architect of much of human suffering, for what is denied in waking life lives on below, shaping thought, behavior, and fate in ways that seem mysterious until analyzed. We are like puppets pulled by strings we cannot see, moved by impulses we do not admit, and sabotaged by forces we do not even know exist. The unconscious is, therefore, not simply a storehouse but a power that demands expression, whether in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in symptoms, or in neurotic suffering. When we say we cannot let go of suffering, it is often because the unconscious will not permit it. Pain is not merely an event that happened in the past. It is material lodged in the depths of the psyche, alive, unfinished, unresolved. The unconscious preserves what the conscious mind rejects, ensuring that the repressed remains active. It is as if within each individual there exists a secret archive of forbidden memories and desires, sealed away from awareness but nonetheless exerting an invisible influence over life. And this archive is not inert. It seeks expression, it pushes upward, it insists on being recognized. In this sense, suffering becomes not just an affliction but a demand a demand of the unconscious to be heard. Dreams reveal this most clearly. In the dream world, the unconscious finds its stage, disguising its truths in symbols and images. A nightmare of falling may echo the helplessness of a childhood humiliation. A dream of pursuit may represent the return of repressed fear or guilt. To ignore these expressions is to leave the unconscious unacknowledged, to allow it to continue its work in symptoms. Similarly, neurotic behaviors are the unconscious breaking into waking life, forcing the subject to feel what he has repressed. Anxiety, compulsions, and irrational fears are not random. They are messages. They are the unconscious speaking in the only language it can, the language of suffering. This is why Freud warned that the unconscious, if left unexamined, will dominate the course of our lives. We may believe we are free, but in truth, our freedom is illusory so long as we remain strangers to the forces within us. The man who thinks himself rational may find himself sabotaging his own success, driven by unconscious guilt. The woman who believes she has chosen her partner freely may, without knowing it, have chosen someone who mirrors the unresolved dynamics of her childhood. These are not accidents. They are expressions of the unconscious seeking its fulfillment. Thus, the unconscious is not only the keeper of suffering, but its perpetuator. We cannot let suffering go because it is not simply ours to release. It belongs to a hidden part of the psyche that demands confrontation, interpretation, and integration. To ignore it is to allow it to rule us from the shadows. Defense mechanisms are the great illusions of the psyche, ingenious strategies invented by the ego to shield itself from the unbearable weight of suffering. At first glance, they seem merciful, protecting us from pain, guilt, or conflict. But Freud revealed their darker truth. These defenses, though they spare us from conscious anguish in the moment, ensure that suffering remains unresolved and therefore eternal. They do not eliminate the problem. They disguise it, displace it, or distort it, while leaving its root intact. The individual, believing himself safe, is instead bound more tightly to his suffering, trapped in an endless cycle of avoidance. Consider repression, the most fundamental of all defenses. By pushing unacceptable thoughts and desires into the unconscious, repression creates the illusion of peace. But this is only a disguise. What is repressed does not vanish. It returns in dreams, symptoms, or neuroses. The person who represses his rage may seem calm, but he suffers mysterious headaches, insomnia, or anxiety. Each symptom a disguised return of what was denied. The defense mechanism has not protected him from suffering. It has merely translated it into another form, one less obvious but no less tormenting. Or take projection, where the individual attributes to others what he cannot bear to admit in himself. The man who represses his own aggression may become convinced that everyone around him is hostile. He lives in constant fear, suspicious of others, always preparing for an attack. In truth, he is tormented not by the hostility of others, but by the hostility within himself. His defense mechanism ensures he never confronts his own shadow, condemning him instead to live in a world filled with imagined enemies. The suffering is thus externalized, but it remains unbroken, for its true source is never faced. Rationalization works similarly. We invent clever explanations for our failures, our losses, our destructive choices. These explanations soothe the ego, protecting it from the humiliation of truth. But what is left unacknowledged festers. The individual who rationalizes his failures as bad luck never confronts his own patterns of self-sabotage. The defense relieves him of guilt but chains him to repetition. His suffering continues, hidden beneath the comfort of excuses. All defense mechanisms share this paradox. They conceal the truth in order to protect the ego, but by concealing the truth, they also conceal the possibility of healing. They keep suffering in motion, endlessly circulating in disguised forms. They are the psyche's way of ensuring survival in the short term while sacrificing liberation in the long term. They buy time, but they do not solve. They create the illusion of safety, but they ensure that what was repressed will return, often with greater force. This is why Freud insisted that the defenses of the ego must be unmasked. As long as the individual remains trapped in these illusions, he cannot escape suffering. The defenses may shield him from pain in the light of day, but they guarantee that, in the darkness of the unconscious, suffering continues to live, waiting to rise again. Freud taught that suffering is not only born of repression and defense, but also of the inevitable clash between instinct and civilization. Within each human being resides the idea, that raw reservoir of instinctual drives filled with desires for pleasure, aggression, and gratification. It knows nothing of morality, nothing of restraint. It demands satisfaction, but life in society imposes limits. Civilization requires cooperation, discipline, and the sacrifice of personal indulgence for the sake of order. The ego and superego rise in response, curbing the wild impulses of the idea, restraining them in the name of survival and morality. Yet this restraint, though necessary, is also the root of an unending discontent. The human being suffers because he is torn in two directions, his instincts pulling him toward gratification, and society forcing him toward renunciation. The child wishes to scream, strike, and indulge every impulse, but learns quickly that such behavior brings punishment. The adult carries this same lesson forward. You must work when you wish to rest. You must restrain your anger when you long to unleash it. You must sacrifice pleasure for responsibility. Each compromise is a small wound. Each renunciation, a reminder that life cannot give what instinct demands. Civilization protects us from chaos and violence, but it does so by chaining the instincts, and those instincts do not accept their imprisonment quietly. This is why so much of human life feels like discontent. The instincts push upward, demanding expression, while the superego punishes with guilt and shame. The individual who acts on his aggression feels remorse. The individual who suppresses his aggression feels anxiety. Either way, suffering emerges. The pursuit of pleasure, whether in love, success, or indulgence, is always met with frustration, for no satisfaction can last, and no satisfaction is complete. Civilization permits only partial fulfillment, and even this must be earned through labor, restraint, and conformity. Freud argued that this conflict cannot be resolved, only endured. The instincts are eternal, and the demands of civilization are unyielding. The clash between the two produces what he called the uneasiness of culture, the unavoidable dissatisfaction of living within the structures that make collective life possible. We are spared the dangers of chaos and anarchy, but in exchange we inherit neuroses, guilt, and the quiet sense that life is never quite enough. Civilization, in protecting us, also makes us sick. This explains why so many feel trapped in a life that appears stable but feels hollow. Beneath the routines of work and duty, the instincts remain unsatisfied, gnawing at the psyche, demanding more than civilization will allow. The individual, torn between these forces, experiences an enduring suffering, one that is not accidental but structural, woven into the very condition of being human. To be civilized is to renounce, and to renounce is to suffer. Freud's deepest insight was that suffering cannot be avoided, but it can be transformed. The unconscious, with all its repressed desires and unresolved traumas, will not disappear simply because we wish it away. Nor will the instinctual conflicts with civilization ever cease. To live is to suffer in some measure, but there is a choice: either remain enslaved to hidden forces, endlessly repeating the same patterns of misery, or confront those forces directly and wrest some measure of freedom from them. The path Freud laid out was not the annihilation of suffering, but its understanding, its integration, and its redirection toward growth. This is why he spoke of making the unconscious conscious. The work of analysis is not to silence the drives or to erase the wounds of childhood, but to bring them into the light where they can be recognized for what they are. When the repressed is uncovered, when the dream is decoded, when the symptom is traced back to its origin, when the defense is unmasked, the individual gains knowledge of himself, and in that knowledge lies power. For what was once an unseen master becomes an object of awareness, something the ego can confront and engage. The suffering does not vanish, but it loses its mysterious, overwhelming quality. It is no longer fate, it is understood. This transformation is subtle but profound. Take the person who suffers from constant anxiety without knowing why. His days are clouded by dread, his nights disturbed by unrest. In analysis, he discovers that this anxiety is the displaced return of repressed hostility toward a parent, hostility he could never acknowledge as a child. When he sees this truth, when he allows himself to admit what was once forbidden, the anxiety no longer rules him blindly. He still feels the weight of the conflict, but now it is his to bear consciously, not a phantom torment arising from the shadows. Suffering remains, but it is reshaped into something tolerable, something meaningful. Freud's method was in this sense not a cure in the naive sense of erasing pain, but a path to a different relationship with pain. Neurosis is the price we pay for ignorance of the unconscious. Healing comes not from denying suffering, but from learning to suffer knowingly rather than blindly. Freud once remarked that analysis could transform hysterical misery into ordinary unhappiness. At first glance, this sounds bleak, but in truth, it is liberation. The individual moves from being the helpless victim of unknown forces to being an active participant in his own destiny. Ordinary unhappiness faced with open eyes is far less crushing than neurotic torment imposed by hidden masters. Thus, the ultimate task is not to dream of a life without suffering, but to claim ownership of it, to recognize its sources, to integrate it into the whole of one's being. In doing so, the individual ceases to be ruled by unconscious compulsions and begins, at last, to live with a measure of self-mastery. Freud's dark wisdom was this: we cannot escape suffering, but through insight we can make it our own, and in that act lies the only freedom possible to humankind.